600 years of stone and silence. 500 years of an unbroken rule that no pope had dared to touch. And then, on a morning in Rome when the light was still low over the Tiber, Pope Leo XIV walked into a room and changed everything. Not with a decree, not with a press release. With a single act that left the Vatican's own officials standing in stillness, unsure of what they had just witnessed. That is where this begins. The tradition in question was older than the printing press, older than Columbus crossing the Atlantic. It had survived the Reformation, 2 world wars, the rise and fall of empires, and the reigns of 27 popes. It was not a minor custom. It was a structural pillar of how the papacy presented itself to the world. A wall built not of marble, but of protocol, of distance, of carefully managed ceremony. And Pope Leo XIV, the first American pope in the history of the Catholic Church, walked up to that wall and took it apart with his bare hands, quietly, without announcement, almost as if he did not realise how enormous the moment was, though those who know him say he understood exactly what he was doing. To understand why this matters, one has to go back, not to the beginning of Robert Francis Prevost's life in Chicago, though that story is remarkable in its own right. One has to go back to the 15th century, to the era when the papacy was rebuilding itself after the chaos of the Western Schism, when the Church was learning, again, how to project authority across a fractured Christian world. It was in that period that the tradition took shape. The idea that the Pope, when appearing before certain formal bodies of the Church, did not initiate. He received, he presided, he responded. But he did not come to anyone. They came to him. The distance was not arrogance. The distance was theology made visible. The Pope as the fixed point, the successor of Peter, the rock, and the world as the thing that moved toward him, not the other way around. That theological logic held for 5 centuries. Through the councils and the concordats, through the era of papal states and their loss, through Vatican I and Vatican II, through the pontificates of reformers and conservatives alike, the formal structure of papal reception remained intact. Popes could be warm, popes could be pastoral, popes could weep in public and embrace the sick and wash the feet of prisoners on Holy Thursday. But in the specific category of formal institutional engagement, the synodal bodies, the curial departments, the gathered councils of bishops, the Pope received. He did not go. And then Pope Leo XIV went. The gathering was not, on its surface, extraordinary. It was a scheduled meeting of the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, the body formerly known as the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the oldest of the Vatican's departments, the one that traces its lineage back to the Inquisition itself, though it has travelled a very long road since then. The Dicastery's prefect, Cardinal Victor Manuel Fernandez, had convened a working session, a procedural gathering of the kind that happens regularly in the Vatican's quiet administrative machinery. The expectation was standard. The dicastery would do its work, would prepare its summaries, and would, in due course, submit its conclusions upward for the Pope's review. That is how the system works. That is how it has worked for generations. Pope Leo XIV did not send a representative. He did not summon the prefect to his study. He arrived, in person, unannounced to most of those in the room. He walked through the door of the meeting space in the Palazzo del Sant'Uffizio, the very building where the Church's doctrinal enforcement has been housed for centuries, sat down at the table among the officials and theologians, and said, in a voice those present described as entirely calm, "I am here to listen, not to preside." The silence that followed lasted several seconds. There is no precise Vatican protocol for what to do when the Pope appears in the middle of a working session and asks to be treated as a participant rather than a sovereign. Nothing in the rubrics covers it. One senior official present reportedly looked at another and then back at the door, as if checking whether what he was seeing was real. A younger theologian later said she had thought in that first moment that she must have misunderstood something, that surely there was a formal ceremony about to begin, that the chairs would be rearranged, that someone would call the room to attention. None of that happened. Pope Leo XIV pulled out the chair, his own chair, without waiting for anyone to offer it, and sat down. And the meeting continued. What he did next was more quietly radical than the entrance itself. He did not speak first. He listened. For nearly 40 minutes, according to those who were present, the Pope sat at the table of the Church's most powerful doctrinal body and took notes. Not ceremonial notes, real ones. A yellow legal pad, the kind one might find in any office in Chicago or Rome, covered in handwriting that the officials nearby could see but could not fully read. He asked 2 questions during that period. Both were specific. Both were technical. And both, the officials said later, demonstrated that he had been reading the dicastery's working documents with a level of detail that surprised even those who prepared them. This is worth pausing on, because it cuts against a narrative that has circulated in some corners of the Catholic media. The narrative that Leo XIV is primarily a pastoral figure, a shepherd of instinct rather than a man of doctrine. The working documents of the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith are not light reading. They are dense, theologically precise, often written in a Latin-inflected Italian that assumes years of formation in scholastic theology. The Pope's questions were not general. One concerned a specific argument in a preliminary document about the theological status of conscience in cases of material cooperation with wrongdoing, a question that sits at the intersection of moral theology, canon law, and pastoral application, and that has no easy answer. The other concerned the historical precedents cited in a draft regarding the ordination question, and whether a particular council's language had been correctly characterised. These are not the questions of a man skimming the surface. These are the questions of someone who has done the reading. And then, after listening and after his two questions, he spoke. Not a prepared address, not a homily, a reflection offered as a participant at the table, in the same tone one might use in a graduate seminar on theology. Careful, provisional, open to being wrong. He said in words that one official present committed to memory because the simplicity of them was startling. The Church's task is not to give the impression of certainty, where the living tradition is still working out its implications. Humility about what we do not yet fully know is not weakness. It is fidelity to the process by which the Spirit actually moves. No one in that room had ever heard a pope say something like that in that setting. Not because the idea was unprecedented. Theologians of the highest standing have made similar arguments for decades. But because popes do not usually say it in working sessions, sitting at a table, in the middle of a bureaucratic meeting, without a prepared text. They say it in encyclicals, carefully worded. They say it in apostolic exhortations, surrounded by layers of nuanced qualification. They do not say it informally, conversationally, as a contribution to an ongoing discussion, in a room where the people hearing it have legal pads of their own and are very much in a position to push back. The prefect, to his credit, apparently did push back, gently, respectfully, as one does, raising a concern about how such a framing might be received in communities where doctrinal clarity is itself experienced as a form of pastoral care. And the Pope listened. He did not dismiss the concern. He nodded, wrote something on his yellow pad and said, "That is exactly the tension, and I do not think either of us has the full answer to it yet." Then he thanked the room, stood up and left, walking out of the Palazzo del Sant'Uffizio through the same door he had entered, back into the Roman morning, as if he had simply gone for a walk and happened to stop in. It took approximately 6 hours for the news to begin moving through Vatican circles. By that evening, it was in the Catholic press. By the following morning, it was being discussed in episcopal conferences from Nairobi to Manila to Buenos Aires. And by the end of the week, it had become something else entirely, a symbol, a signal, a Rorschach test onto which every Catholic commentator with a platform was projecting his or her own reading of what the Francis years had meant and what the Leo years might mean. The reactions divided almost immediately along the fault lines one might expect, though not quite in the ways one might predict. Some traditionalist voices, those who had watched the Francis pontificate with unease, responded with surprising openness, noting that what the Pope had demonstrated was not doctrinal softness, but doctrinal engagement, that a Pope willing to sit in a room and argue theology with the DDF was a Pope who took doctrine seriously, even if the style of the engagement was unfamiliar. Others in the progressive wing of the Church found themselves cautiously encouraged, reading in the gesture a willingness to treat the Church's ongoing theological work as genuinely open rather than performatively open, a distinction that matters enormously to theologians who have spent years watching consultations that felt predetermined. And there were those in the curial centre who were simply unsettled, not because they opposed what the Pope had done, but because 500 years of institutional logic is not easily recalibrated in an afternoon, and the implications of what Leo XIV had begun were not yet clear. The tradition he broke was not merely ceremonial. That is the point that gets missed in some of the coverage, which treats the event as a story about style, about a Pope who is informal, who is collegial, who prefers yellow legal pads to gilded chairs. Style matters, and the symbolism of papal behaviour is real and consequential. But the deeper tradition that Leo XIV interrupted was epistemological. It was about who in the Church is understood to be the primary recipient of divine guidance on questions of doctrine, Whether the teaching office of the papacy functions as a unilateral pronouncing authority or as a participant, an extraordinarily authoritative participant, in an ongoing communal discernment. That question has been debated by Catholic theologians for a very long time. What Pope Leo XIV did was not resolve the debate. He enacted one side of it in an unrepeatable moment in the room that most symbolises the other side of it. And he did so without a speech, without a document, without a press conference or a curial decree or a synodal process or any of the institutional apparatus through which popes normally make their theological positions legible. He did it by showing up. There is a detail from that morning that did not make it into most of the early reporting, but that has since been confirmed by two separate officials who were present. When Pope Leo XIV arrived at the Palazzo del Sant'Uffizio, he was carrying, in addition to the yellow legal pad, a single book, not a breviary, not a copy of the documents under discussion. It was a well-worn paperback copy of John Henry Newman's An Essay on the Development of Christian Doctrine, the 19th century work in which Newman, then still an Anglican, worked out the theological argument that would eventually bring him into the Catholic Church, and which remains one of the most sophisticated accounts in all of Christian thought of how doctrine can genuinely change without losing its continuity with what came before. The spine of the book was cracked. The margins, those who caught a glimpse reported, were dense with pencil marks. He did not quote Newman in the meeting. He did not reference the book at all. He simply had it with him. But for those who know the tradition of papal intellectual life, who know that Leo XIII took his papal name partly in reference to the great scholastic Leo, and that this Leo XIV chose his name with his own set of resonances in mind, the presence of that book was not incidental. Newman was a man who believed that the Church thinks over time, that the Spirit works through the long, sometimes painful, always continuing process of the community, wrestling with its inheritance. He was also a man who understood that such a belief, taken seriously, requires a certain kind of courage, the courage to trust a process whose conclusions one cannot fully predict. Pope Leo XIV, sitting at a table in the Palazzo del Sant'Uffizio with a worn paperback and a yellow legal pad, was making an argument. Not with words, or not primarily with words, with presence, with the simple, extraordinary fact of being there. The 500-year tradition he broke was real. The room it was broken in was real. The officials who sat in that room and found themselves, for the first time in their institutional lives, in a meeting that the Pope had not come to preside over, but to participate in. They were real, and the experience was one they will carry for the rest of their careers. But the deeper break, the one that will take decades to fully understand, was with an idea about what the papacy is for. Not the abolition of papal authority. Nothing in what Leo XIV did diminishes the extraordinary weight of that office, or the Church's teaching on its nature. But a reimagining, performed rather than announced, of how that authority might be exercised in a century that has grown deeply suspicious of power that cannot sit at the table and listen. That suspicion is not only a secular phenomenon, it lives inside the Church too, in the theologians who have spent their careers feeling that their work is reviewed rather than engaged, in the bishops who have felt the gap between synodal consultation and actual decision-making, in the laypeople who have wondered whether the Church's internal conversations are real or merely formal. Pope Leo XIV walked into that suspicion and offered it not a solution, but a gesture. Whether the gesture becomes a pattern, whether the yellow legal pad becomes a symbol of a new mode of papal governance, or remains a remarkable one-morning anomaly, is something only time will answer. What is already answered, and what the officials who stood in that room in the first silence after his entrance already knew, is that something shifted. The calendar of that day now has a before and an after. The Palazzo del Sant'Uffizio has a before and an after, and the 500-year tradition, the one that said the Pope receives, that the rock does not come to the river but the river comes to the rock, has a before and an after, not abolished, not repudiated, but opened, in the way that a door is opened, not destroyed, not removed, but no longer closed. Pope Leo XIV walked out of the building that morning back into the light of Rome and went about the rest of his day. A general audience, 2 bilateral meetings, evening prayer in the chapel of the Domus Sanctae Marthae, where he still lives, as Francis did. Another choice that is itself a statement. Another tradition not quite broken, but gently, persistently set aside. He gave no formal comment on what had happened. He made no announcement. His press office confirmed that the visit had occurred, described it as a pastoral engagement with the dicastery's ongoing work, and offered nothing further. Somewhere in Vatican City that evening, the prefect of the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, sat with his own notes from the morning. Whatever he was thinking, he kept it private. The younger theologian, who had wondered, in the first moment, whether she was misreading the situation, wrote in her journal, she shared this months later, in a reflection published in a small theological quarterly, that she had gone home that night and reread the passage in the Acts of the Apostles, where the First Council of Jerusalem reaches its decision, not by the pronouncement of a single authority, but by the gathered community saying, "It has seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us." She wrote that she did not know whether what had happened that morning was the beginning of something or an isolated gesture, but she wrote that she had felt, sitting at that table, that the room was alive in a way that institutional rooms rarely are, that something was genuinely at stake, that the conversation was real. A child does not understand the weight of 500 years of tradition. A child does not know the difference between a working session of the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith and any other meeting in any other building. But in the piazza outside, on the day Pope Leo XIV made his entrance through that door, a group of school children from a parish in the Prati neighbourhood were on a tour of Vatican City, brought by their teacher to see the churches and the squares and the ancient stones of the place their faith calls home. One of them, 7 years old, gap-toothed, carrying a small backpack with a picture of a cartoon saint on it, looked up at the Palazzo del Sant'Uffizio as the group passed and asked his teacher what building that was. The teacher, not knowing what was at that moment unfolding inside, said it was the building where the church thinks about its most important questions. The boy considered this for a moment and then said, "Does it get the right answers?" The teacher laughed and said she hoped so. The boy nodded, satisfied, and walked on. The church has been asking that question for 2,000 years. Pope Leo XIV, on that morning, did not answer it. He did something subtler and perhaps more important. He demonstrated that he was willing to be in the room where the asking happens, not above it, in it. That may be the most consequential thing a pope has done in that building in 500 years. Not a statement, not a decree, not a condemnation or a declaration. A presence, a yellow legal pad, a worn copy of Newman, and a willingness to say, in front of people whose entire professional formation has prepared them to receive answers from on high, "I do not think either of us has the full answer yet." Rome was not ready for what happened next. But perhaps the church, somewhere beneath the centuries of stone and ceremony, has been waiting for it longer than anyone knew. The days that followed moved at the particular pace that Rome reserves for its most significant moments. Outwardly slow, inwardly seismic. The city's surface changed nothing. The fountains ran. The tourists photographed the colonnade. The bells of St. Peter's marked the hours as they have marked them for centuries. But beneath that surface, in the offices and corridors and quiet dining rooms, where the church's institutional life actually happens, the conversation about what Pope Leo XIV had done in the Palazzo del Sant'Uffizio was not stopping. It was deepening. The first formal response came not from the Vatican press office, but from a bishop, a German cardinal whose name has been associated, for the better part of a decade, with the more structurally reformist wing of European Catholicism. He did not issue a statement. He gave an interview to a Catholic newspaper in Munich, and in that interview, he said something that was immediately clipped and circulated across every Catholic social media platform in 6 languages. He said, "What the Holy Father did is not a revolution. It is a retrieval. He retrieved something the Church had before it learnt to protect itself with distance." He paused in the interview, the journalist noted, as if deciding whether to continue. Then he continued. "The question now is whether the institution is capable of receiving what he is offering. Institutions have very powerful immune systems." That phrase, the institutional immune system, became, in the weeks that followed, something close to shorthand in theological circles for the central question the morning had raised, because the immune system was already responding. Not with hostility, not with the kind of open resistance that would have made for cleaner headlines, but with something more characteristically Roman. A very careful, very measured, very respectful process of absorption and reinterpretation that threatened to dissolve the gesture into something manageable. Memos were written. Historical precedents were research-board. A senior canonist produced a 9-page analysis arguing, with considerable learning, that what the Pope had done was fully consistent with the traditional understanding of papal primacy. That the Pope's presence at a working session of a dicastery was an exercise of his supreme authority, not a modification of it, and that the informality of the engagement changed the optics, but not the substance of the relationship between the pontiff and the body he had visited. This analysis was not wrong, exactly. It was precise. It was lawyerly. And it was, in the judgment of several theologians who read it carefully, a masterpiece of the very thing Pope Leo XIV had walked into that room to gently challenge: the institutional reflex to make the unprecedented continuous with the precedent, to sand off the edges of the new until it fits the shape of the old. One of those theologians, a woman who holds a chair in fundamental theology at a pontifical university in Rome, and who had not been present in the meeting but had spoken with several who were, wrote a short essay in response. She did not publish it immediately. She sat with it for 2 weeks. When she finally sent it to a journal, she titled it, in a deliberate echo of Newman, On the Development of Papal Style. Her argument was that style is never merely style in the papacy, that the way a pope inhabits his office is a form of teaching, as real and as consequential as any document he signs, and that what Leo XIV had taught that morning, in the most embodied and unrepeatable way possible, was that authority and proximity are not opposites, that one can be, simultaneously, fully who one is and fully present to another, that the chair at the table and the chair of Peter are not in contradiction. Her essay, when it appeared, generated more letters to the journal's editor than any piece published in the previous 4 years. But while the theologians wrote, and the canonists analysed, and the cardinals gave carefully worded interviews, something else was happening, something that no Vatican official had anticipated, and that no institutional immune system was equipped to process. The story had reached the parishes, not the version in the theological journals, not the version in the Catholic newspapers with their careful ecclesiastical vocabulary, the human version, the version told by people who had heard it from other people, passed along in the WhatsApp groups of parish councils and the chat threads of Catholic mothers groups and the conversations after Mass in small churches in places very far from Rome. The version that went, the Pope showed up. He sat down. He said he was there to listen. He took notes on a yellow pad. He said he didn't have all the answers. And then he left. In that telling, the 500 years of tradition and the specific theological stakes and the Newman paperback all fell away. What remained was something almost embarrassingly simple. A leader who showed up where the work was happening, sat down among the people doing it, and admitted out loud that he was still learning. In a world that has grown exhausted by leaders who perform certainty they do not possess, the image of the Pope with the yellow legal pad landed with a force that no press conference or encyclical could have generated. It landed because it was true, because it had happened in a real room with real people who had been surprised by it, because no communications team had staged it, and no photographer had been present to frame it correctly. It had happened the way the most important things usually happen, without warning, without preparation, in the middle of an ordinary morning. A priest in a parish in Krakow told his congregation about it during his homily the following Sunday. He had been reading about it all week, he said, and he had been trying to understand why it moved him so much. And then he realised. It was not the gesture itself that moved him. It was what the gesture implied about the nature of authority, when it is exercised with genuine humility, that it does not diminish, it multiplies, that a pope who is willing to say, I do not yet have the full answer, does not thereby become less of a pope. He becomes more of a shepherd. And shepherds, the priest reminded his congregation, do not stand at a fixed point and wait for the flock to come to them. They go where the flock is. They sit in the field. They listen for the sounds that tell them something is wrong or something is right. They are present in the way that presence actually costs something, not the managed presence of the formal visit, but the vulnerable presence of the person who has come without a script and is genuinely paying attention. The congregation in Krakow was quiet when he finished. Then an older woman in the third row, 70 years old, who had lived through the end of communism and the papacy of John Paul II and all the complicated decades since, raised her hand, which is not something that happens in the middle of a Catholic homily in Krakow. The priest, startled, nodded at her. She said, It sounds like he is not afraid. She paused. The ones who are afraid are always the ones who cannot sit down. The priest had no answer for that. He simply nodded, and the Mass continued. Back in Rome, Pope Leo XIV continued his days with the same quality of attention that had characterised the morning in the Palazzo del Sant'Uffizio. There were audiences and meetings and the endless documentary work of the papacy, the letters to be signed, the decisions to be reviewed, the global church's 10,000 urgent questions pressing in from every direction at once. None of it was simple. None of it admitted of the clean resolution that the world increasingly demands of its institutions, and that institutions increasingly perform without possessing. But those who worked closely with him during those weeks noted something that they struggled to articulate precisely. A quality in the room when he was present that was different from what they had experienced with his predecessors. Not warmer exactly, though he was warm. Not more intelligent, though his intelligence was evident, something more specific than either of those things. One senior official, a man who had served in the Vatican for 26 years and had worked under 3 popes, tried to name it in a conversation with a colleague. He said, "He is actually here. When he is in the room, he is in the room, not managing the room, not performing for the room, in it." That quality, the quality of genuine presence, of attention that is not divided between the current moment and the image of the current moment, is rarer than it should be in positions of great institutional power. Power has a way of inserting glass between the person who holds it and the world they inhabit. The glass is protective, and it is also distorting. And what Pope Leo XIV had done, in the Palazzo del Sant'Uffizio on that ordinary Roman morning, was step through the glass, not permanently, not without the full weight of everything the office requires him to carry, but through it, for the length of a working session, with a yellow legal pad and a worn copy of Newman, and a willingness to say, "The spirit is still moving, and none of us has caught up yet." That is the tradition he broke. And Rome, slowly, unevenly, with all the complexity that 2,000 years of institutional life produces, was beginning to understand that being broken open is not the same as being destroyed. For those who want to follow every development. As Pope Leo XIV continues to reshape the papacy, subscribing to this channel ensures nothing is missed. A comment sharing which moment from this story landed hardest would mean a great deal.